A bombshell revelation has just emerged in the Lilly and Jack Sullivan case that changes everything. After 7 months of carefully maintained silence, after 7 months of presenting a united front with his partner Malaysia Brooks Murray, Daniel Martell's secrets are finally coming to light. Information that he's kept hidden since the morning of May 2, 2025, when 2 young children vanished from their rural Nova Scotia home. Information that investigators have been quietly gathering, piecing together, building a case around, and information that may finally answer the question that's haunted Canada for months. What really happened to 6-year-old Lilly Sullivan and 4-year-old Jack Sullivan? This isn't speculation. This isn't rumor. This is based on newly revealed evidence, on witness statements that have emerged, on forensic findings that paint a picture Daniel Martell never wanted anyone to see. For months, he's played the role of devastated stepfather, standing beside Malaysia at press conferences, helping search for the missing children, maintaining that they simply wandered into the wilderness. But behind that carefully constructed facade, investigators have been uncovering a very different story. A story of lies and deception. A story of a man with secrets he was desperate to hide. And a story that may finally bring justice for 2 innocent children who deserved so much better than what they received from the adults who were supposed to protect them. Before we reveal the shocking details that have emerged about Daniel Martell and what investigators believe he's been hiding, you need to subscribe to True Crime Vault immediately and hit that notification bell. We've been following every development in the Sullivan case since day one, bringing you information and analysis that goes deeper than mainstream coverage. If you want the real story, if you want answers, subscribe now. Smash that like button because your engagement helps push this content to more people, and the more attention this case gets, the harder it becomes for anyone involved to continue hiding the truth. Drop your thoughts in the comments as we go through this evidence. This is where we build the case together as a community. Now let's expose the secrets Daniel Martell has been keeping and why they may finally lead to answers about what happened to Lilly and Jack Sullivan. To understand the significance of what's just been revealed, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to May 2, 2025, when Daniel Martell and Malaysia Brooks Murray reported that Lilly and Jack had disappeared from their property on Gairloch Road in Lansdowne Station, Nova Scotia. The story they told was straightforward, almost rehearsed in its simplicity. The children had been playing in the backyard that morning. The adults were inside with their 1-year-old daughter Meadow for what they claimed was just a short time. They could hear the children playing. Everything seemed normal, and then suddenly the house went quiet. When they came out to check on Lilly and Jack, the children were gone. Simply vanished. The back gate was open, and the dense wilderness that surrounded their isolated property stretched out in all directions. A dangerous maze of forest, ravines, and thick undergrowth where 2 small children could easily get lost and die of exposure. From the very beginning, Daniel Martell positioned himself as the concerned stepfather. He was the one who claimed he heard what might have been a child's scream coming from the forest during the initial search. Though helicopter noise made it impossible to confirm, he participated actively in organized searches, walking through the woods calling the children's names. He spoke to media outlets, his voice breaking with apparent emotion as he begged for anyone with information to come forward. He made emotional appeals, standing beside Malaysia, presenting the image of a stepfather who loved these children as if they were his own, who was destroyed by their disappearance. He did everything that would make him look like an innocent man desperate to find his missing stepchildren. But investigators were watching him carefully from the very first day, and what they saw didn't quite match what he was saying. Behavioral analysts who reviewed footage of his media appearances noted subtle inconsistencies. His body language at press conferences seemed rehearsed, almost performed. When he spoke about the children, his emotional displays seemed to be triggered on command, rather than arising naturally from genuine grief. He would cry when cameras were on him, but moments before and after, witnesses reported him seeming calm, almost detached. His timeline of events on the morning of May 2 had small inconsistencies that grew more pronounced the more he was questioned about details. And as the investigation progressed over days and then weeks, as evidence was methodically gathered and witnesses were systematically interviewed and forensic analysis was conducted on every aspect of the case, a picture emerged of a man who was hiding something significant. Not just a minor detail or an embarrassing fact, but something dark. Something that could explain what really happened to Lilly and Jack Sullivan during those crucial hours when only Daniel and Malaysia claimed to know where the children were. The first major crack in Daniel Martell's carefully constructed story came when investigators obtained security footage from a gas station 30 kilometers from the Sullivan property. This footage would prove to be one of the most damning pieces of evidence against Daniel's credibility. The video, time-stamped at 11:47 p.m. on May 1st, showed a vehicle that matched the description of Daniel's truck in nearly every detail. A dark-colored pickup with specific body modifications, visible damage on the passenger side door that matched damage on Daniel's vehicle, and what appeared to be an identical license plate number, though the angle made it difficult to read completely clearly. The footage showed a male figure exiting the vehicle and beginning to pump gas. The individual was wearing dark clothing, a hoodie pulled up over his head despite it being a relatively mild spring evening, making definitive facial identification difficult from the camera angles available. But forensic video analysts who examined every frame of the footage, who compared vehicle characteristics and measured the individual's height and build based on reference points in the image, who analyzed movement patterns and gait, determined there was better than 85% probability that the vehicle was Daniel Martell's truck and that the individual pumping gas was Daniel himself. This finding was critically important because May 1st was the last day anyone outside the immediate family can definitively verify seeing Lilly and Jack alive. Security cameras at a Dollarama store in the neighboring town of New Glasgow captured the children with the family at 2:25 p.m. that afternoon. The footage shows what appears to be a normal family shopping trip. Malahia pushing a cart with baby Meadow seated in it, Daniel walking alongside, and Lilly and Jack, 6 and 4 years old respectively, walking with the family, looking at items on shelves, behaving exactly like any children in a store would behave. That Dollarama footage represents the last independent, verifiable proof that those children were alive. After that timestamp at 2:25 p.m. on May 1st, only Daniel Martell and Malaya Brooks Murray claimed to have seen them. When investigators first asked Daniel to provide a detailed timeline of his movements and activities on the evening and night of May 1st, he stated clearly and without hesitation that he'd been home all night. According to his account, Malahia had gone to bed around 9 or 10 p.m., and he stayed up later watching television or browsing on his phone, but he remained at the house throughout the entire night. He never left the property. He gave absolutely no indication whatsoever that he'd driven anywhere that night, made no mention of any errands or trips, provided no reason why he might have been away from the house during those crucial hours. But the security footage from the gas station proved definitively that this was a lie. He had left the property, he'd driven 30 kilometers, a roughly 20-minute journey under normal conditions, to this particular gas station. He'd arrived at 11:47 p.m., which means he would have left his house around 11:15 or 11:30. He'd pumped gas. He'd gone inside the convenience store where interior cameras captured him for approximately 4 minutes, browsing various sections of the small store in what body language experts described as an agitated, distracted manner. He'd purchased something, though the items aren't clearly visible in the footage, paying with cash rather than card, ensuring there would be no electronic record of the transaction. And then he'd left, with no cameras tracking his route back to the property. This late-night trip that Daniel deliberately concealed when giving his statement to police occurred during the most critical time period in the investigation. The last night the children were confirmed alive by independent evidence. The hours when investigators believe something terrible happened to Lilly and Jack. And Daniel Martell lied about where he was during those hours. That's not a minor oversight. That's not stress-induced forgetfulness. That's a calculated deception about his whereabouts during a time period when a crime was likely being committed. When confronted with the security footage during a subsequent interview, Daniel's response followed a predictable pattern that investigators see frequently from guilty suspects. His first reaction was immediate, flat denial. He stated it wasn't him in the video, said it must have been someone else with a similar truck, pointed out that the footage quality wasn't perfect, that the lighting at small rural gas stations isn't ideal, that you couldn't see the person's face clearly enough to make a positive identification. He denied leaving the house that night, stuck rigidly to his original story, refused to budge from his claim that he'd been home all evening and night. But when investigators pushed back firmly, when they pointed out all the vehicle characteristics that matched his truck, when they noted the license plate that, while partially obscured, appeared to match his registration, when they brought in the forensic video analysis showing high probability it was him based on multiple factors, his story suddenly and dramatically changed. The denial evaporated. Suddenly, he admitted that, okay, maybe he did go out that night. Maybe he took a drive. He'd forgotten about it, he claimed, because of all the overwhelming stress and confusion of the missing children. His mind had been in complete chaos, and a simple trip to the gas station, such a routine and unremarkable event, had simply slipped through the cracks of his memory. He offered that he probably went to get cigarettes or some snacks or something similarly mundane. Nothing significant, just a quick errand, which is why it didn't seem important enough to mention when giving his initial detailed timeline to investigators. But investigators weren't accepting this revised explanation at face value, and neither should anyone following this case, because they checked his story thoroughly. They looked at what that particular gas station actually sells. It's a small rural convenience store with limited inventory, the kind of place that stocks the basics for travelers passing through and local residents who need something after other stores have closed, and they definitively do not sell cigarettes. So Daniel's claim that he went there specifically to buy cigarettes was immediately, provably false. His explanation for the trip fell apart the moment it was examined. Furthermore, a thorough review of Daniel Martell's bank records and credit card statements shows no debit or credit card transaction at that location that night. No electronic record of any purchase. The store's transaction records were obtained through court order, and while they show various sales transactions during the late evening hours of May 1st, without knowing the exact minute of Daniel's purchase, and without having electronic payment information to match, investigators couldn't definitively identify which specific transaction was his. But the absence of any card transaction in his financial records means that if he did buy something, he paid with cash that had to come from somewhere. And this is where the financial evidence becomes relevant and deeply suspicious. In the 2 weeks before Lilly and Jack disappeared, there were large cash withdrawals from Malahia's bank account. We're not talking about the typical $20 or $40 someone might withdraw for gas money or small purchases. These were substantial amounts. $800 withdrawn on April 18th, $600 on April 22nd, $450 on April 26th, another $500 on April 29th, just 3 days before the children were reported missing. Add it all up and you're looking at over $2,300 in cash withdrawn from an account that rarely had more than a few $100s in it at any given time. When investigators asked both Malahia and Daniel about these large cash withdrawals during formal interviews, neither could provide clear, specific, verifiable explanations. Their answers were vague, evasive, and contradictory. Malahia said it was for various household expenses, couldn't remember specifically what. Daniel said he didn't really keep track of the finances, that Malahia handled that. But when pressed for any details about what over $2,000 in cash was used for, neither could account for where the money went. It didn't go to rent, which they paid by check. It didn't go to utilities, which were paid electronically. It didn't correspond to any major purchases that could be verified. The money simply vanished into untraceable cash transactions. This pattern of large cash withdrawals, followed by inability to explain their use, combined with Daniel's late-night gas station visit where he paid cash, creates a picture of someone deliberately avoiding creating an electronic paper trail. If you're planning to do something you don't want traced back to you, you use cash. You withdraw it in amounts large enough to cover what you need, but not so large that banks flag the transactions. You spread the withdrawals over time, and then you use that cash for purchases you don't want anyone to know about. Cleaning supplies that might be used for crime scene cleanup, trash bags in quantity, tools for digging, whatever you might need for disposing of evidence. You buy these items at different stores, so no one location sees a suspicious bulk purchase, and you pay cash every time so there's no credit card statement showing what you bought, when you bought it, and where. The interior security footage from the gas station is frustratingly incomplete in terms of what can be definitively observed. The camera angles show the individual who investigators believe is Daniel shopping, moving through the small store, picking up various items from shelves and examining them. But the footage doesn't clearly capture what specific items were ultimately taken to the counter and purchased. But investigators are very interested in what someone might need to buy at a gas station at nearly midnight on the last night their stepchildren were seen alive. What purchase would you be willing to lie about to police? What would you pay cash for to avoid a paper trail? The questions hang ominously over this evidence. Let's think logically and carefully about the timeline this security footage creates. If Daniel Martell was at that gas station at 11:47 p.m., he would have had to leave his house around 11:15 or 11:30 p.m. based on the 30-kilometer driving distance and typical travel time on rural roads at night. This timing is supposedly after Malahia had gone to bed for the night, after the children had supposedly been put to bed hours earlier, sometime between 9 and 10 p.m., according to the varying accounts. The house should have been quiet, everyone sleeping. He drove 30 kilometers to this specific gas station, not the closest gas station to his property, but one that required a deliberate journey. He spent time there, pumping gas and shopping inside for several minutes. He bought something with cash, and then the footage shows him leaving the parking lot. But here's what's crucial. There are no other security cameras tracking his route back home. No traffic cameras on the rural roads between that gas station and the Sullivan property. No way to verify when he actually returned home or if he made any other stops along the way. So we can prove he left his house around 11:15 p.m. We can prove he was at the gas station at 11:47 p.m. But we cannot prove when he returned. Did he go straight home? Did the return trip take the expected 20 to 25 minutes? Or did he take a detour somewhere? Did he make another stop at a location that didn't happen to have security cameras? Was there another purpose to this late-night journey beyond whatever he purchased at the gas station? These are questions Daniel Martell has never adequately answered. Questions that hang over his credibility and his claimed innocence. And perhaps most critically, what was happening at the house while he was gone? This is a question investigators have explored extensively. Were Malahia and the 3 children all there? Were they asleep, as the story suggests? Or had something already happened by the time Daniel left the house? Was Daniel disposing of something during this late-night drive? The timeline is suspicious. The lies about the trip are suspicious. The cash payment is suspicious. Everything about this incident points towards someone with something to hide, someone involved in activities he knew would look incriminating if discovered. Now let's talk about Daniel Martell's background, because this is information that's been carefully investigated and reveals a pattern of behavior that's deeply, profoundly concerning when you're looking at someone who had custody and control over 2 young children who then disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Daniel Martell has a history that he's kept carefully hidden from public view, a past that he doesn't advertise and that Malahia may not have fully known about when she entered into a relationship with him. Court records obtained by investigators show that Daniel has prior criminal convictions. These aren't recent offenses and they're not the most serious crimes on the books, but they paint a picture of someone who's had significant trouble with authority, with following rules, with controlling his behavior. There's a conviction for theft from several years ago, another for breach of probation conditions, a third for mischief causing damage to property. These are the kinds of offenses that show poor judgment, poor impulse control, disregard for others' property and rights. More significantly, and more disturbingly, multiple women who had romantic relationships with Daniel Martell at various points over the past decade were identified by investigators and interviewed extensively about their experiences with him, and what they described independently, without knowledge of what the others had said, creates a consistent and troubling pattern. 3 different ex-partners came forward, some voluntarily when they saw news coverage of the missing children and recognized Daniel, others located through investigative work. All 3 women described Daniel as having serious anger management issues. They described someone who could be charming and personable in public, who could present as a loving partner when other people were watching, but who had a very different, much darker personality in private settings. All 3 described incidents where he became physically aggressive during arguments. Not just yelling or verbal abuse, though there was plenty of that, but actual physical violence or threats of violence. The first woman, who dated Daniel approximately 8 years ago, described an incident where during an argument about something trivial, something she can't even remember now, Daniel grabbed her by the arms hard enough to leave bruises and shook her while screaming in her face. She said she was genuinely terrified in that moment, afraid of what he might do next. She ended the relationship shortly after but never reported the incident to police because she was afraid of retaliation. The second woman, who was in a relationship with Daniel about 5 years ago, obtained a restraining order against him after their relationship ended. Court documents from that restraining order, which investigators obtained, describe a pattern of escalating controlling behavior, verbal abuse, and physical intimidation. The final incident that prompted her to seek legal protection was when Daniel showed up at her workplace after she'd broken up with him, caused a scene, and made threats about what he would do if she didn't come back to him. The restraining order was granted and remained in effect for 2 years. The third woman, who dated Daniel most recently before he met Malehia, described an incident that's particularly chilling given what happened to Lilly and Jack. She said that during an argument in their shared apartment, Daniel became so enraged that he punched a hole in the wall next to her head. The fist went through the drywall inches from her face. She said she believed in that moment that he'd been aiming for her head and had deliberately hit the wall instead as a demonstration of what he was capable of. She said she felt genuine fear for her life and for her safety. She ended the relationship and moved out within days, cutting off all contact with him. Now, having a history of domestic violence issues doesn't automatically make someone a child murderer. Plenty of people have troubled relationships, anger management problems, moments in their past they're not proud of. People can genuinely change. People can work on themselves, get therapy, learn better coping mechanisms, and become different than they were. Not everyone who's been abusive in one relationship will be abusive in the next. But when investigators are looking at a case involving missing children who may have been harmed, when they're building a profile of the people who had access to those children and control over their lives, this kind of history matters tremendously. It establishes a clear, documented pattern of someone who uses intimidation and violence to control situations and people. Someone with very poor impulse control who responds to stress and conflict with aggression. Someone who's capable of causing serious harm when angry, frustrated, or feeling threatened. Someone who has demonstrated repeatedly that when pushed, when facing problems or conflicts, his response is violence rather than more appropriate coping mechanisms. This is exactly the kind of background profile that makes someone capable of harming children when under extreme stress. Family members, when interviewed extensively by investigators, also provided concerning information about Daniel's behavior, specifically in the months leading up to the children's disappearance. His mother, Janie Mackenzie, who lived on the property in a separate building and was therefore in a position to observe the household dynamics regularly, told investigators that she'd heard frequent arguments between Daniel and Malehia. These weren't minor disagreements or the normal tensions every couple experiences. These were loud, heated fights about money, about the children, about their relationship, about their future. Janie described hearing shouting, hearing objects being thrown, hearing doors slamming. She said Daniel seemed to be under tremendous stress due to long-term unemployment and mounting financial problems, and that he sometimes took that stress out on those around him. Other family members who had occasion to visit the property or interact with the family described observing Daniel being inappropriately harsh with Lilly and Jack. They were careful to say they never saw what they would definitively call abuse. Nothing that rose to the level where they felt compelled to call Child Protective Services, but they described discipline that seemed excessive, yelling at the children over minor infractions, punishments that seemed disproportionate to whatever the kids had done wrong. A general atmosphere where the children seemed afraid of making Daniel angry. One relative described a specific incident at a family gathering several months before the disappearance that left multiple people uncomfortable. Jack, who was only 4 years old, accidentally knocked over and spilled a cup of juice. It was a complete accident, the kind of thing that happens with young children constantly. But Daniel's reaction was explosively, disproportionately angry. He yelled at Jack in a way that made the child burst into tears. He berated a 4-year-old for being clumsy and careless. When other family members tried to calm the situation, tried to point out that it was just an accident and that Jack was just a little boy, Daniel turned his anger on them. He became confrontational with adults who dared to question his parenting. The incident created such tension that the family gathering ended early with people leaving uncomfortable and upset. Teachers at the elementary school that Lilly and Jack attended provided additional concerning information when they were interviewed as part of the investigation. When investigators showed photographs of various family members, asking if the teachers had ever interacted with these people during school pickups or parent-teacher conferences or school events, multiple teachers immediately identified Daniel Martell, and their descriptions of interactions with him were uniformly negative. One teacher described him as aggressive and confrontational when discussing a minor disciplinary incident involving Jack. The boy had gotten in trouble for something small, The kind of thing that happens in elementary school classrooms every day and is typically handled with a brief conversation and maybe losing recess privileges. But when the teacher called home to inform the parents, Daniel answered, and his reaction was completely inappropriate. Rather than accepting the teacher's professional account of what had happened and working cooperatively to address the behavior, Daniel became defensive and accusatory. He questioned the teacher's competence. He suggested the teacher was picking on Jack unfairly. He raised his voice in a way that was aggressive and intimidating. The teacher said she'd never had a parent react that way to such a minor incident and that Daniel's behavior was concerning enough that she documented the interaction and reported it to the school principal. Another teacher described seeing Daniel during school pickup on a few occasions and noticing that both Lilly and Jack seemed nervous around him. She said the children's body language changed when they saw him. They became more subdued, more careful. It wasn't the excited reaction most kids have when a parent arrives to pick them up. It was something else. Something that made this experienced teacher wonder if the children were afraid of their stepfather. All of this background information, all of these documented patterns of behavior, established that Daniel Martell was absolutely not the gentle, loving, patient stepfather he portrayed himself as in public and media appearances. He was someone with a documented history of violence and aggression. Someone who struggled profoundly with anger management and impulse control. Someone who was under enormous financial and personal stress in the months before the children disappeared. Someone who had displayed concerning, inappropriate interactions with Lilly and Jack that other adults had noticed and worried about. Someone who fit the profile of a person capable of harming children when pushed to a breaking point. But the most explosive and damning revelations about Daniel Martell's secrets come from what investigators found when they conducted comprehensive forensic analysis of his electronic devices. When police executed search warrants on the property and seized computers, tablets, and smartphones belonging to both Daniel and Malehia, they brought in digital forensics specialists to extract every piece of data from those devices. And what they found on Daniel's personal cell phone is absolutely horrifyingly damning. In the weeks leading up to the children's disappearance, Daniel Martell was conducting internet searches that reveal a deeply disturbing, calculated mindset. While the specific exact search terms and queries haven't been fully disclosed publicly because this information represents critical evidence that would be presented at trial if charges are ever filed, and prosecutors don't want to reveal their entire hand and give defense attorneys months or years to develop explanations and counter-narratives. Sources extremely close to the investigation have confirmed the general nature and topics of these searches. Daniel was researching, in detail and with clear purpose, topics related to concealing evidence of crimes. He searched for information about how to clean crime scenes in ways that would defeat forensic analysis. He looked up what chemicals can destroy or degrade DNA evidence. He researched how police dogs, specifically cadaver dogs, track scents, and what methods can be used to defeat or confuse those dogs. He searched for information about how long it takes for human remains to decompose under various environmental conditions. He looked up what happens to bodies left in water versus bodies buried in soil, comparing decomposition rates and likelihood of discovery. These are not casual searches born of curiosity. These are not someone watching a true crime documentary and idly wondering about investigative techniques. These are targeted, specific, methodical searches for information that would be extremely useful if you were planning to commit a crime and hide evidence of that crime. The searches went deep into topics, following multiple links, reading detailed articles, drilling down into specific technical information. This is research conducted with clear purpose and intent. The timing of these searches is perhaps even more damning than their content. The forensic analysis shows that the bulk of these disturbing queries occurred in the final 2 weeks before May 2nd. The searches intensified as the date approached, with multiple searches per day in the final 72 hours before the children were reported missing. On the night of May 1st itself, the last night anyone can verify the children were alive, Daniel conducted searches late into the evening about topics directly related to what investigators believe happened to Lilly and Jack. When confronted with this internet search history during interviews, Daniel Martell's explanations were wholly inadequate and transparently false. He initially claimed he didn't remember making such searches, which is absurd given how specific and extensive they were. Then he tried suggesting that maybe he'd been watching true crime content on television and got curious about how investigations work, about how police catch criminals, He claimed it was just entertainment, just idle curiosity, the same kind of thing millions of people do when they watch crime shows and then Google-related topics. But forensic digital analysts can absolutely tell the difference between casual browsing and targeted research conducted with specific purpose. When someone watches a documentary and casually Googles a related topic out of mild curiosity, they typically read one or maybe two articles and then move on to something else. Their browsing history shows them bouncing around to different unrelated topics. But Daniel's search history doesn't look like that at all. His searches were focused and methodical, multiple queries on the same topics using different phrasings, following links to increasingly technical and detailed sources, spending significant time on pages with specific information about evidence concealment and body disposal, taking notes based on what investigators found. This is research with clear criminal purpose, not entertainment. There's more disturbing content on Daniel's phone. The forensic analysis also revealed that Daniel had systematically deleted a massive amount of data from his device in the days immediately following the children being reported missing. Text message conversations, entire threads going back months, were deleted. Call logs showing who he'd communicated with and when were cleared. Photos were removed from the phone's memory. Internet browsing history was carefully erased. This wasn't someone doing routine phone maintenance or clearing space. This was someone engaging in deliberate evidence destruction. Fortunately for investigators, forensic specialists who do this work for a living understand that deleted data isn't truly gone. It remains on the device's memory until it's overwritten by new data, and with proper tools and techniques, much of it can be recovered. The specialists working on Daniel's phone were able to retrieve substantial portions of what he'd deleted. And what they recovered provides crucial insights into his state of mind, his relationship problems, and potential motive. Among the recovered deleted content were text message conversations between Daniel and Malehia that showed severe relationship problems in the days and weeks before the children disappeared. These weren't loving exchanges between happy partners. These were bitter arguments conducted via text, accusations flying back and forth, discussions about whether their relationship should even continue. Messages where Daniel expressed clear, explicit frustration about being expected to help support and care for children who weren't biologically his. In one particularly chilling text exchange from April 28th, just 4 days before the children were reported missing, Daniel wrote to Malehia words to the effect of, "We need to do something about this situation. We can't keep going like this. Something has to change." When Malehia responded asking what specifically he meant, what he wanted to do, his reply was vague but carried ominous implications. He wrote something along the lines of, "You know what I mean, we need to figure something out about this whole mess." This exchange, along with dozens of other messages showing relationship conflict and frustration about the children, was among the data Daniel deliberately deleted in the days after May the 2nd. He didn't want investigators seeing these messages. He didn't want anyone to know what he and Malehia had been discussing. But forensic recovery brought them back, and now they're part of the evidence file building a case against him. There's also evidence on the recovered data that Daniel had been researching life insurance policies in the weeks before the children disappeared. Specifically, he'd searched for information about whether step-parents could be beneficiaries on life insurance policies for stepchildren, whether policies paid out in cases where bodies weren't found, how long someone had to be missing before they could be declared legally dead for insurance purposes. This suggests a potential financial motive that investigators are exploring seriously. Did Lilly and Jack have life insurance policies, perhaps taken out when they were born? If something happened to them, would Daniel or Malehia benefit financially? These are dark, terrible questions, but they're questions that must be asked when trying to understand why someone would harm children. Let's talk in detail about what happened on the property during the night of May 1st and the early morning hours of May 2nd, because new witness information has emerged that fundamentally contradicts Daniel's account and strongly suggests something terrible occurred during those dark hours when the rest of the world was sleeping. Janie McKenzie, Daniel's mother who lived in a separate building on the same property, initially told police a relatively simple story. She'd gone to sleep around 8:50 a.m. on the morning of May 2nd. She was awakened at some point by her dog barking at something outside. While awake, she heard what she interpreted as children's voices and laughter, and the creaking sound of the swing-set chains. She assumed Lilly and Jack were playing outside and went back to sleep. This testimony initially seemed to support the story that the children were alive and well that morning. But under repeated, detailed questioning over subsequent weeks and months, as investigators pressed her for every detail she could remember, Janie's story has evolved considerably, and she's revealed information she initially didn't think was important or relevant. And what she's now disclosed is deeply significant and troubling. Janie now admits that she heard unusual, unexplained sounds coming from the main house during the night of May 1st into May 2nd. She woke up at some point during the night. She's uncertain of the exact time, but believes it was somewhere around 2 or 3 in the morning based on the darkness and quietness. She heard what sounded like furniture being moved in the main house. Not the normal sounds of someone walking around or getting a drink of water. Heavy scraping sounds, objects being dragged across floors, the sounds of significant physical effort and movement. At the time, Janie assumed Daniel was doing something, maybe rearranging furniture or doing some kind of late-night project. She's admitted that Daniel sometimes does odd things at odd hours, that he struggles with insomnia, and when he can't sleep, he sometimes engages in activities that might seem strange to others. So she didn't think much of hearing these sounds at 2 or 3 a.m. She figured her son was just being Daniel, doing something that made sense to him, and she went back to sleep without investigating. But in retrospect, knowing that the children disappeared, knowing the timeline of events, those sounds take on extremely sinister significance. What was being moved at 2 or 3 in the morning? Heavy objects that made dragging and scraping sounds? Furniture doesn't make sense because why would someone rearrange furniture in the middle of the night? What else is heavy enough to make those sounds? What else would someone need to move during the hours of darkness when no one could see? Janie has also clarified and walked back some of her certainty about hearing the children playing on the morning of May 2nd. She's been absolutely clear and consistent from the beginning that she never actually saw Lilly and Jack that morning. She never looked out a window to visually confirm their presence. She never went outside to say good morning or check on them. All she experienced were sounds coming from outside that she interpreted as children playing, children's laughter or voices, the rhythmic squeaking and creaking of swing-set chains. But actual visual confirmation? None. She heard sounds and made assumptions about what those sounds meant. And investigators have spent considerable time exploring the disturbing possibility that those sounds were deliberately manufactured, that Daniel or Malehia staged audio evidence to create the impression that the children were alive and playing outside that morning when in reality they were already gone, already dead, already disposed of. Think about how easy it would be to create the auditory illusion of children playing. You could play recordings of children's voices and laughter from a phone or speaker. You could manually push empty swings to create the creaking sound of chains. You could create noise that someone hearing from a distance, not actually seeing the source, would interpret exactly the way Janie interpreted what she heard. Why would someone do this? To establish a crucial element of their timeline. To create a witness who could testify that she heard the children alive at approximately 9 a.m. on May 2nd. This would support the story that the children disappeared that morning after 9 a.m., when the reality might be that they died or were killed much earlier, possibly the previous evening or during the night. Creating false evidence of life at 9 a.m. would deflect suspicion away from what really happened during the hours of darkness. A neighbor who lives down the road from the Sullivan property, not close enough to see the property directly but close enough to sometimes hear sounds when wind and weather conditions are right, has also come forward with significant information that adds another piece to the disturbing timeline puzzle. This neighbor, whose identity has been protected, reported to police that in the very early morning hours of May 2nd, at approximately 5 or 5:30 a.m., based on when he'd woken up to use the bathroom and noted the time, he heard what sounded like a vehicle engine running for an extended period of time. This wasn't the normal sound of a vehicle starting up and driving away. This was an engine that seemed to be idling or running in place, the sound continuing for what he estimated was 10 to 15 minutes. At the time, he didn't think much of it. People warm up vehicles on cool mornings. People run generators for power. There are innocent explanations for hearing an engine running. But looking back now, knowing that children disappeared from that property, knowing that Daniel lied about his movements during the critical time period, knowing that he made an unexplained late-night trip to a gas station, this report of a vehicle running at 5:30 a.m. becomes potentially significant and disturbing. Was Daniel making another trip during those early morning hours? Was he transporting something? The timeline that emerges when you put all the witness accounts together is chilling. Security footage definitively places Daniel at a gas station 30 kilometers away at 11:47 p.m. on May 1st. Janie heard heavy objects being moved inside the house at approximately 2 or 3 a.m. on May 2nd. A neighbor heard a vehicle engine running for an extended period at approximately 5:30 a.m. And then, at 10:01 a.m., the 911 call was made reporting the children missing. What was happening during those hours? What was Daniel doing? Investigators believe, based on all the evidence they've methodically gathered, that Lilly and Jack died or were killed sometime during the evening of May 1st, or during the night. They believe Daniel was centrally involved, either as the person who directly caused their deaths or as someone who helped conceal evidence and dispose of bodies after the fact. They believe the late-night trip to the gas station at 11:47 p.m. was part of this, possibly to purchase supplies needed for cleanup or body disposal. They believe the sounds of heavy objects being moved at 2 or 3 a.m. were the sounds of bodies being prepared for transport or being moved to a temporary storage location. They believe the vehicle running at 5:30 a.m. was Daniel making a trip to dispose of remains in a location that hasn't been discovered. And they believe everything that happened after that, the manufactured sounds of children playing to establish a false timeline, the 911 call hours later, the searches and media appearances and emotional displays, all of it was carefully planned theater designed to create a narrative that would explain the children's absence without implicating the people responsible. Let's talk about Daniel's relationship with Malahia and how that dynamic has evolved during the investigation, because this reveals another crucial layer of the secrets he's been keeping and the control he may be exerting to keep those secrets from emerging fully. In the immediate days after the disappearance, Daniel and Malahia presented to the world as a united couple. They appeared together at press conferences, they coordinated their statements to media, they supported each other publicly, they presented the image of parents united in grief and desperation to find their children. But then, something changed. Cracks appeared in that united front. Less than a week after the children vanished, Malahia suddenly left the area. She packed up Baby Meadow and went to stay with her family in another part of Nova Scotia, hours away from Pictou County. And she didn't just leave quietly, she blocked Daniel on all social media platforms. Facebook, Instagram, whatever digital connections they had. She severed them all publicly and visibly. This was not a subtle separation. This was a dramatic severing of their relationship that everyone could see. According to family members who hosted Malahia during this period of separation, family who were later interviewed extensively by police about what they observed and what Malahia said to them, she was in absolutely terrible emotional condition, which would be completely expected and understandable for a mother whose children have just disappeared. But her emotional state wasn't just general grief about the missing children. She was expressing very specific anger, directed very specifically at Daniel Martell. Multiple family members reported hearing her make statements like, "This is all his fault. He knows exactly what happened to them. I should have protected them from him. I never should have left them alone with him. I should have seen this coming." These are not vague expressions of looking for someone to blame because grief needs a target. These are direct, specific accusations. These are statements indicating she believed, or at least strongly suspected, that Daniel was responsible for what happened to Lilly and Jack, that he knew where they were or what had occurred, that she had failed in her duty as a mother to protect them from a threat that Daniel represented. When police followed up on these statements immediately, when detectives traveled to where Malahia was staying to interview her in detail about what she told family members and what she actually knew or believed about Daniel's involvement, her responses became much more guarded, vague, and evasive. She walked back the accusations significantly. She said she was just devastated and upset and looking for someone to blame because the pain was completely unbearable. She said she needed to direct her anger somewhere, and Daniel was a convenient target. She said she didn't actually mean anything specific by those comments. She claimed that Daniel wasn't a perfect person, but she didn't genuinely believe he'd harmed her children. She softened and qualified all the accusations, tried to take back the words, presented a much more ambiguous picture. But experienced investigators know that initial statements, words spoken in moments of raw emotion before someone has had time to think about implications and consequences, are usually much closer to truth than carefully crafted later statements. When Malahia first processed what had happened, when she was in the immediate aftermath and speaking from genuine emotion rather than calculation, her instinct was to accuse Daniel. to say he knew what happened, to express that she should have protected her children from him. That reveals what she truly believed in those unguarded moments before fear or self-preservation or legal advice caused her to reconsider speaking so openly. Then after some time passed, after there had presumably been communication between her and Daniel or his family despite the social media blocking, after she'd possibly consulted with legal counsel about the implications of accusing him without proof, her story changed completely. She reconciled with Daniel. They got back together. They resumed living together and presenting that united front to investigators and to the public. They coordinated their stories carefully, making sure their accounts aligned and supported each other. Why would Malahia do this? Why would a mother reconcile with someone she'd accused of harming her children? Investigators believe they understand the dynamic at play here, and it's dark, because Daniel has information about Malahia's involvement and knowledge as well. If she turns on him completely, if she provides testimony against him, if she tells investigators everything she knows or suspects, he can implicate her in return. They're bound together by mutual culpability, by shared secrets, by the reality that if one goes down, the other likely goes down too. So they've made an unspoken pact, possibly even an explicit agreement to protect each other, to maintain their combined story, to refuse to provide information that would implicate the other, knowing that doing so would implicate themselves. This kind of pact between co-conspirators is extremely common in serious criminal cases. When two people are involved in a crime, when both have guilty knowledge, they realize quickly that they're only safe as long as they both maintain silence. If one breaks, if one decides to cooperate with investigators and provide truthful testimony, both of their carefully constructed defenses collapse. So they stay allied even if they hate each other, even if they're terrified of each other, because the alternative is far worse. The alternative is prison. Daniel and Malahia's reconciliation wasn't motivated by love or forgiveness or a desire to rebuild their relationship. It was motivated by survival, by both of them understanding that their best chance of avoiding criminal prosecution is to stay united, to refuse to turn on each other, to maintain the story they've constructed no matter how much pressure investigators apply. As long as neither breaks, as long as both continue denying any involvement beyond the official story of children wandering off, prosecutors face the difficult challenge of proving what happened without either defendant's cooperation. But there are signs that this fragile pact is starting to crack under sustained pressure. Sources close to the investigation have reported that in recent weeks and months, there have been renewed conflicts between Daniel and Malahia. Arguments that neighbors have overheard through open windows or thin walls. Tensions that family members have noticed during interactions. The stress of maintaining an elaborate lie for 7 months, the constant fear of investigators finding the evidence that would prove guilt, the psychological burden of carrying such terrible secrets, all of it takes an enormous toll on relationships and on individual mental health. Investigators are absolutely aware of these tensions, and they're applying strategic, calculated pressure specifically designed to widen the cracks in the alliance between Daniel and Malahia. They've been conducting separate interviews with each of them, carefully asking detailed questions about the other's behavior, movements, statements, and actions. They've been confronting each with evidence that implicates the other, subtly suggesting that their partner may not be as loyal as they think. They've been making it clear through their questioning that someone is definitely going down for what happened to Lilly and Jack, that charges will eventually be filed, and that the first person to cooperate fully and provide completely truthful information will be in a dramatically better legal position than the person who continues lying until the end. This is absolutely standard investigative technique when dealing with co-conspirators. You drive a wedge between them. You make each of them paranoid that the other might be about to turn. You create an environment where cooperating first seems like the smart, self-preserving choice. And very often this pressure succeeds. One person's nerve breaks. One person decides that protecting themselves is more important than protecting their partner. One person reaches out to investigators and says they're ready to tell the truth, and the whole conspiracy collapses. There are concrete indications that this strategy may be starting to work with Daniel Martell specifically, that he may be reaching a psychological breaking point where the burden of the secrets he's carrying becomes too heavy. Sources have reported that his behavior has become increasingly erratic and concerning over recent months, that he's drinking far more heavily than before, that he's having severe trouble sleeping, often staying awake all night, that he's become paranoid, suspicious of everyone around him, interpreting innocent conversations as threats. These are classic signs of someone under severe psychological distress, someone whose carefully maintained facade is starting to crumble. Daniel has also reportedly made concerning comments to family members about how the stress is becoming unbearable, how he can't keep living like this, how the weight of everything is crushing him. These kinds of statements are very often precursors to confession. They're someone testing the waters, unconsciously preparing themselves for the relief that would come from finally telling the truth, from unburdening themselves of terrible secrets. In a recent interview with investigators, according to sources with knowledge of what occurred, Daniel became emotional in a way he hadn't in previous interviews. His careful control slipped. He started talking about regrets, about wishing he could go back and make different choices, about how things spiraled out of control in ways he never intended. These are not the statements of someone who's innocent and wrongly accused. These are the statements of someone with guilty knowledge who's getting close to admitting what they've done. Investigators responded to these emotional moments very strategically and carefully. They emphasized understanding rather than judgment. They said they recognize that people make terrible mistakes, that situations can spiral beyond anyone's control, that someone who takes responsibility and shows genuine remorse will be treated very, very differently by the legal system than someone who continues lying and refuses to accept accountability. They're offering Daniel what feels like a path toward redemption, toward unburdening himself, toward ending the crushing psychological pressure he's under. And based on his responses, on the way he's reacting to this approach, investigators believe he may be close to taking that path. Will Daniel Martell eventually break? Will he reach a point where the psychological weight becomes literally unbearable and he finally tells investigators the complete truth about what happened on May 1st and 2nd? That's the outcome investigators are working toward, the breakthrough they believe may be coming. Because the reality is that without bodies, without definitive physical evidence that proves beyond any doubt that the children were murdered rather than lost, without a confession from someone with direct knowledge, this case remains extraordinarily difficult to prosecute successfully. The circumstantial case that's been built against Daniel is strong, perhaps overwhelming. The lies about his movements, the internet searches about concealing evidence and disposing of bodies, the deleted text messages showing relationship problems and frustration about the children, the financial evidence of large cash withdrawals that can't be explained, the history of violence and anger issues, the witness accounts of suspicious activities during the critical hours. All of it points unmistakably toward guilt, but experienced defense attorneys can create doubt around circumstantial evidence. They can offer alternative explanations. They can argue that suspicious behavior doesn't prove murder. They can emphasize that without bodies, you can't even prove the children are dead, much less prove who killed them. What prosecutors desperately need is for Daniel to tell them where Lilly and Jack are, to explain what actually happened during those dark hours, to provide the details that only someone directly involved would know, to lead them to remains that can be recovered and examined. A confession would transform this case from frustratingly difficult to prosecute into one where conviction becomes virtually certain, and investigators believe they may be very close to getting exactly that. Let's address the physical evidence that's been gathered but hasn't been widely publicized, because these findings, while not individually conclusive, collectively paint a damning picture that supports everything else investigators have learned. Soil samples taken from multiple locations around the Sullivan property showed chemical anomalies in several specific areas: elevated nitrogen levels, changes in pH, chemical signatures that are consistent with biological decomposition occurring in those locations. These aren't the normal background readings you'd expect from regular soil. These are indicators that something organic decomposed there. Now, that could be animal remains, could be from a pet that was buried there years ago, but the specific chemical profiles and the concentrations detected are more consistent with human decomposition than with typical animal remains. And the locations where these soil anomalies were found are areas that Daniel had complete access to, areas he could have used to temporarily bury bodies without being observed. Luminol testing conducted inside the house revealed traces of blood that had been cleaned but left microscopic residue that reacted to the chemical. The blood traces were found primarily in two locations: Jack's bedroom and the bathroom that the children used. The patterns suggested someone had made efforts to clean up blood, but luminol reveals what the naked eye can't see. DNA testing is still being conducted on these traces, And if the blood is definitively confirmed through DNA analysis to belong to Lilly or Jack, that would constitute major evidence that something violent happened to them inside that house. It would prove that blood was shed, that someone was injured seriously enough to bleed, and that someone then cleaned up that blood rather than calling for medical help. Cadaver dogs, when worked through Daniel's truck multiple times, showed particular and repeated interest in the truck bed and in the area behind the back seat of the cab. They didn't give the full trained alert response that would indicate definite presence of human remains, but they showed clear interest behavior, intense sniffing, pawing at areas, circling back repeatedly to the same spots. This suggests they detected some trace of decomposition scent, but not at levels strong enough for a definitive alert. If human remains had been transported in that truck at some point and then removed, residual scent would remain even after cleaning. Decomposition fluids can seep into upholstery, into carpet, into the tiny cracks and crevices of a vehicle interior. Even thorough cleaning doesn't remove it all, and dogs can detect traces that are invisible and undetectable to humans. All of these pieces of physical evidence are being meticulously documented, photographed, analyzed by the best forensic experts available. None of them alone constitutes absolute proof of murder, but collectively, they corroborate and support the theory that investigators have developed based on all the other evidence. They provide scientific backing for what the circumstantial evidence strongly suggests, and they all point directly at Daniel Martell being involved in what happened to Lilly and Jack Sullivan. Now I need to make something absolutely clear before concluding. Daniel Martell has not been charged with any crime related to the disappearance of Lilly and Jack Sullivan. He maintains his complete innocence. He says the children wandered off into the wilderness and that he had absolutely nothing to do with their disappearance. In the eyes of Canadian law, he is innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. That is a fundamental principle of justice, and it must be respected. And it is theoretically possible, however unlikely it seems when you examine all the evidence collectively, that he's telling the truth, that the internet searches have some innocent explanation, that the lies about his movements were just mistakes made under impossible stress, that the deleted messages and the financial irregularities and the suspicious activities are all coincidental, that the forensic findings are all explainable by factors other than murder. It's possible. But when you look at the totality of the evidence, when you see the pattern that emerges from connecting all the dots, when you understand the timeline and the behaviors and the secrets that have been uncovered, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to believe in his innocence. The evidence against Daniel Martell is overwhelming. And investigators who've spent 7 months living this case, who've examined every detail and interviewed every witness and analyzed every piece of forensic data, they believe they know what happened. They believe Daniel Martell is responsible for what happened to Lilly and Jack Sullivan. And they believe that eventually, the complete truth will emerge and justice will be served. The investigation continues actively every single day. Police haven't given up. The case file grows thicker with every new piece of information. Forensic analysis continues on evidence that's been gathered. The reward of $150,000 remains available for information that leads to finding the children or to charges being filed. And investigators continue applying pressure to the people they believe are responsible, waiting for the moment when someone's resolve breaks and the truth finally comes out. What do you think about these revelations? Do the secrets that have emerged convince you of Daniel Martell's guilt? Do you believe he'll eventually confess? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to stay informed about every development in the Sullivan case, subscribe to True Crime Vault immediately. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, smash the like button, and share this video. The more attention this case receives, the more pressure exists for truth and justice. And if you have any information about Daniel Martell, about what happened to Lilly and Jack, about where they might be, contact the Royal Canadian Mounted Police immediately. Your information could be the key that finally brings these children home and ensures that whoever harmed them faces full accountability. Thank you for watching. The truth is emerging. Justice is coming. And we'll continue covering every development until Lilly and Jack Sullivan finally receive the justice they deserve.